Good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Coombs. I'm the rector of St Matthew's, and it's lovely to welcome you here this evening to our latest ReThink evening, which we run with our great friends from God First Church. Welcome to you guys as well. For those for whom English is not your first language, we have a wonderful thing called Breeze Translate. If you click on that QR code just to the right of the screen, that will bring up whatever is said this evening in a language of your choice. And if you're hard of hearing, it's a very good way to follow it as well, because you can have it in English. Now, in ReThink, we take contemporary issues and examine them from a Christian perspective. And our topic this evening is racial division and reconciliation. And we are really, really glad to have Owen Hylton with us to help us think about this incredibly important and relevant topic. Howard, the minister from God First Church, is going to introduce Owen in just a moment. But let me just tell you what the format is. Owen is going to speak, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. And we're going to be using an app called Slido. For those of you who don't know Slido, Joseph will just bring up the slide now. If you click onto this will enable you to ask questions as we go along. So we gather the questions during the talk, and then at the end, I will field the questions, and we'll try to answer the most. So what it does is you can vote for other people's questions. So we will ask the most popular questions first. So do just click on that. That will take you to the Slido site, and then you can click on any questions that you like, or you can type in questions that you want to ask. Now, this is such an important topic for us, especially those of us who've never experienced racism or discrimination ourselves. Racist abuse and attacks are in the news every day of the year, and particularly in the news at the moment. Many in our communities are victims, often silently, coping with terrible abusive behaviour and sometimes violent attacks. And our churches really need to be much better informed and to know how to respond better. So I'm really, really pleased that we've got Owen here tonight, who's going to help us to do just that. But I'm going to hand over to Howard, who knows Owen much better than I do, so he's going to introduce him.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. It is a really, as Richard said, a very topical topic, and in a town like ours, perhaps doesn't feel as heated, but still real. So it's great to have Owen, and Owen, why don't you come up? Owen and I we ministered together in a church in London, which when I first started working there, I think out of 200 people, there's some people who are here in that church who are now in Cheltenham, but there was probably maybe a dozen people of colour in that church. That church is now probably over 2,000 people. 75% of people from different backgrounds. So Owen and I shared ministry in that church together. And Owen, why don't you tell us, are you on there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what you're doing now? Don't go to your book launch just yet.
No, I'm not going to. No.
He was just reaching for his book.
Yeah, no, I was. Okay, so my background. So I was born in London. My parents came over from Jamaica. I'll say a little bit about that in my kind of presentation. I was born in London and grew up in southeast London all my life. My parents are from Jamaica. I'm married to Pauline. We've been married for 36 years, and we got a year-old granddaughter and 3 daughters. And I've got a son-in-law he's actually born in London, but also from the Philippines. Right now I lead a church called Beacon, which is in Brixton in South London, and I also lead a group called the Reconciled Church group with a good friend of mine, Rosie, here, and we've been leading that really since George Floyd, and that will come out in my kind of presentation as well. I'm a bit sad because West Ham have gone down, so that's probably a thing for me.
I didn't mention that.
No, I know you didn't. And I went to your toilet and remembered you're a Leeds fan because there's a book there. So I was a bit disappointed about that as well. So that's kind of probably the sum of me.
And you're currently pastoring a church in Brixton?
Yeah, Beacon Church in Brixton.
Okay.
So I've
Brilliant.
been doing that for 17 years.
Let's put our hands together.
Okay, so we couldn't get a subject that's more topical. We didn't plan it this way, but this is what's happened. I'm going to start by... talking a little bit about the kind of the world in which we live. And what I want to do is give you a bit of context for the world in which we live. Because so often you could be forgiven for thinking that race became an issue like 3 years ago. Yeah, if you just look around the world that we live in now and in the UK, you could be forgiven for thinking that, this has become an issue in the last, few years. But as I've said, I was born in this country back in 1967. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of race and migration in this country and a little bit of my story as part of that. I'm going to mention I've got these two books that you can purchase if you want. This book I actually wrote back in 2009. I finished it the month Barack Obama becomes president for the first time. This book was first published on the 27th of April of this year, and I finished it probably in the second year of Trump's second term. So the landscape is very, very different, and the world is a very, very different place, and those two books kind of reflect that. But if we think about, kind of the issue of race and reconciliation and migration, and if we go back to post-war, because sometimes I think our view of things is shaped by what we know and don't know about history. And so a little bit of understanding of history might help us in kind of beginning to unpack some of this journey. In 1948, you might know the story. There was a ship that came over from the Caribbean called the Empire Windrush. And on that ship, there was around 400, Caribbeans who were coming to the UK ostensibly at the invitation of the government in order to help rebuild the mother country after the war. And so that ship came in, and it was significant for this reason. It was the beginning. It wasn't that there hadn't been any migration to the UK before that. There had been migration to the UK from different countries before that. But this was the beginning of the first migration to the UK of a significant number of people who I suppose were obviously different. And over that period between 1948 and probably about 1962, probably a couple of 100,000 people came over from the Caribbean, and in the 60s they were coming over from other places as well. But that was a significant number, to the point where in the 50s there was absolutely no law against discrimination. Yeah? You could discriminate against people for their jobs, for their homes, for their pubs and clubs. You could discriminate against anyone you liked in the 50s. There was no law that stopped you from doing that. The first law that came in was in 1962, and it was the Commonwealth and Immigration Act, and it came in to restrict immigration from what they called the New Commonwealth. And the New Commonwealth was the Caribbean and Africa. It didn't restrict it so much from what we knew as the Old Commonwealth, which was Australia, Canada, South Africa. But from the New Commonwealth in 1962, laws came in that began to restrict people. So after 1962, you couldn't get in as easily. My parents came in 1960. The first piece of legislation that came in that began to protect, I suppose, migrants who had come over occurred 17 years after the first migrants. So the first migrants come in 1948. In 1965, you get the first Race Relations Act, and that act meant it was illegal to discriminate against people who wanted to come to the pub or the club. Yeah, they were allowed to do it. Now, actually, what a lot of those migrants did was they started their own pubs and clubs. The other thing that they did, because they struggled to get housing, they started their own community ways of raising money in order that they could get homes. Yeah, I grew up in a home where my parents used to give money to what they called a partner, and every week you'd go round to someone's house, you'd put money in, and you would get a draw maybe once a year of so many thousands of pounds or so many hundreds of pounds, and that would help you to buy whatever you wanted to buy because you couldn't borrow money from the bank. They wouldn't lend you money. So this was back in the kind of 50s and early 60s. Then in 1965, as I say, the Race Relations Act made it illegal to discriminate against people in public spaces like hotels, pubs and clubs and things like that. It became illegal in 1965. In 1968, there was another law that came in, and it was the Race Relations Act that changed the way that employment worked and public services and housing. So the government were basically saying, look, we've got all these people that have come over and they're having children here. So I was born in 1967, and we've got to find a way whereby their children are not necessarily unable to settle if they want to do that. In 1968, as part of that government decision to change the law and to bring in a law that meant that you couldn't then discriminate in housing and all of those, that was the legislation that Enoch Powell spoke against when he talked about the rivers of blood speech and his fear that, look, if we open the door, who knows what's going to happen, and we're going to have rivers of blood going in our cities. And that was kind of his fear, and that was what kind of he was talking about. It was that particular legislation which was really designed for people like me. It was designed to ensure that people who were born here could find jobs in time, could find housing in time. So that was in 1968 that law came in. Obviously, as I say, up until then, you could discriminate against people. What happened after the 60s, in the 70s, I would say this issue around race and immigration, it kind of then went to the margins of society. You stopped hearing it talked about maybe so much in Parliament, and it kind of went to the margins of society. There was one other act that came about in 1976. So having had those acts in the 60s, in 1976, the Race Relations Act made indirect racism illegal. So up to that point, you could directly say, oh no, I'm not going to employ you because you're this or because you're that. And then after a while, they said, look, we can't keep doing this. They're going to make indirect racism illegal, and structural, institutional racism became illegal. In the mid-70s to the early 80s, I would say racism remained visible, but it didn't remain visible, as I say, in Parliament, but it remained visible in two particular groups, certainly where I grew up, in South London. And that was the National Front and the British National Party. Now, that was always a bit strange for me, because I went to a school where there were people who were members of the National Front. Yeah, they were in my school, in my class. There were people I knew. I remember walking along the road in Catford one Saturday, and they were protesting outside Woolworths. We don't have Woolworths anymore, but they were protesting outside Woolworths, and I saw there a guy from school, and I said, all right, Adam. He said, all right. Yeah, it was a bit weird, but that's what kind of happened back then in the 70s and the kind of early 80s. And so it kind of went to the margins. You had these groups, and some of the hotbeds of those places were places like Eltham, Welling. In Welling there was a little shop which was a British National Party shop that you could, well, I don't know, well, no, it did sell things, I remember I didn't go into the shop, but I saw the shop. So you had places like that were kind of common in that part of South London for many, many years. I want to just give you two stories that happened to me in the 70s and very early 80s before I move on. The first is, as I already said, I'm a West Ham fan. I've been a West Ham fan since like 1974, yeah, so a long time. And I've been to see West Ham in their old ground, but actually I always found it difficult and scary because they were one of, that particular club had a lot of, I suppose, far-right members, yeah? So it wasn't necessarily a safe place to go. The first time I ever went, but I loved football anyway, I just loved football. And I remember, I think I was about 11 years old, when two of the guys from the church took me to a football match. When I was about 11 or 12, maybe I was even younger. And it was at Charlton Athletic, another team local to us. And it was the late 70s, I think it was a League Cup match. It was in, I can't remember if it was an evening or a Saturday, I can't remember the detail. What I do remember is this. They were playing a team again called Stoke City. And as I say, I was about 11. And these guys, so they were two guys in the church. They're big men in the church who at times I found them scary, but they were also very kind to me. Yeah. And we went to this match, and the thing I remember about it is we were playing Stoke City, and Stoke City had one black player on their team called Garth Crooks. And Garth Crooks, the score was 2-2, and Garth Crooks scored a last-minute penalty, so Stoke won the match. Yeah. And he scores the penalty. I think it must have been night, because I don't remember seeing it clearly. He scores the penalty, and the crowd in unison absolutely go for him. Yeah, they're screaming at him, like all sorts of, I suppose, racist language. They're literally screaming. And I'm standing there. Remember, I'm an 11-year-old boy. And one man who I didn't know, so that my two friends were there, but I don't think they fully knew what to say. One man said to me, "It's all right, son, they're not talking about you." I was like, "Oh, thanks, I'm not sure what the difference is, but thanks." Yeah? I remember that quite a kind of, I had a strong memory. The last time, so that was in the late 70s, I went to England in the Euros final at Wembley in 2021. You're getting this impression I love football. So I go there with my brother-in-law, and it's the match where we lose to Italy, and it's 3 black players who miss the penalties. Yeah, Saka, Rashford, Sancho, I think. And I remember when they missed the penalties thinking, Gareth, why did you put them up? Because in that moment, I became fearful. Yeah, so this is 5 years ago. I became fearful because I thought, okay, how am I going to get home from here? Yeah, 1978, I'm in a match. I hear everyone screaming racial abuse. 2021, I wouldn't say everyone was screaming it, but loads of them were screaming it. And also it comes up on social media. So those two kind of experiences. The other thing that I grew up with, if you think about today, and if you think about Brixton, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Brixton, and you might be thinking to yourself, oh, Brixton, that's a place, you don't want to go there, it's a bit dangerous and all of that. And today, when I think about young people today, and particularly young black people, the kind of concern you might have for them is like there's a lot of gang violence and all of that. When I grew up as a teenager, I didn't have a fear of gang violence from other young black kids. There weren't gangs then. What I did have a genuine fear over was skinheads. That was my experience. And I don't just mean I had a theoretical fear. I've been chased, I've been threatened, I've been, I went through all of that kind of thing in the 80s. That was my big fear. It was being beaten up by skinheads. It wasn't being beaten up by other black kids. So the race thing kind of went to the margins. It went out to these groups. You had huge protests in places like Brixton, in places like Lewisham. There was big riots in 1981 because people were reacting to laws that allowed the police to stop people and search them. There was huge reaction to that. There was a riot in 1985, which happened in Brixton, which came about because a woman who was in her 50s was shot by police in her home, a black woman in her 50s. When they went to her home to look for her son, they couldn't find her son, but they shot her. And she ended up dying. Oh no, she didn't end up dying. She ended up dying much later, but she was in a wheelchair off the back of that. There's actually a memorial for her now in Brixton. So those were some of the kind of things that were going on in the 70s and the 80s. In the 90s, things kind of changed a little, and there was a shift to more multiculturalism, optimism, and tolerance. And part of that came about because even though it didn't happen here, you might remember Mandela was released from prison in 1991, and he becomes president of South Africa in 1994. And I remember I couldn't help but feel optimistic about the world. I couldn't help it. Yeah, even though it wasn't here, he had become very famous. The UK had been very influential in even getting him released. If you remember, there used to be a protest outside the South African embassy for years leading up to Mandela being released. And then there was the big concert about Free Mandela. Anyway, he comes out in 91, he becomes president in 94. Then in 1993, I already mentioned the area of Welling and Eltham. In 1993 was when Stephen Lawrence was murdered in Eltham. Again, not far from where I lived. I mean, a few miles away, but not far from where I lived. But I did work at the time. I used to work for the Crown Prosecution Service, so I was aware of some of that, the backdrop to that case. So in the 90s, there was a shift to a bit more multiculturalism, a bit more optimism, a bit more tolerance. In 2004, you had the EU expansion, and what that meant, if you remember, large numbers of Eastern Europeans began to come. I don't know if you remember, there had been people waiting on the Polish border for ages. Once Poland joined the EU, they rushed across, and actually they weren't going anywhere else but here. So they came in huge numbers in 2004. Then, as I say, Obama becomes president in 2009. And you couldn't help, if you were black in the world, you couldn't help but feel hopeful. You couldn't. I remember watching him come president, but in my heart, I also knew this. I'm hopeful, but I'm also thinking there's a silent majority that hasn't spoken yet. That was a genuine thought I had. There's a silent majority that hasn't spoken yet. Obama becomes president. He lasts for 2 terms. And then, really, 2016, the silent majority, I think, finds its voice. And I'll be honest, this isn't a political comment. This was just me, like as a pastor, praying and all of that. In 2016, 2 things happened. Do you know what were the 2 things happened in 2016? Does anyone know? Brexit and Trump. Yeah? Now, I'll be honest. I'm praying against Brexit, and I'm praying against Trump. Yeah? In my own private prayers, no one knows, I'm praying, and then I'm saying to God, it becomes obvious that I think Trump's going to win. Yeah? And Brexit, I think it's going to happen. I remember saying, God, what is the world going to look like if those things happen? Yeah? That's my own private prayers, my own devotional. I'm not talking to anyone about it, but that is what I'm beginning to think about and beginning to fear. So Trump becomes president, and Brexit happens. Then, obviously, Trump becomes president. He loses that next kind of election, and we're in lockdown. And in lockdown, George Floyd gets murdered. Now, I wrote this book in 2009, or it came out in 2009. Let me be honest as to why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because, Howard and I are in this church. I think Howard had gone by now, and people were looking at our church, which was becoming more and more diverse, and they were thinking, wow, you're a great example of the kind of church that we're wanting to build. That's what people were saying to us. I was now on the inside. I was working for the church. I was the first and, at that point, the only black staff member on the church staff. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, this is great. People are loving the fact that we're a diverse church. But when I come onto the inside of it, I don't know that we're quite what people think we are. And so I write a book because I want to help. I'm like, okay, I just need to find a way of trying to help. I think there's a bit of naivety in that, but I'm trying to find a way to help. So I write this book. It comes out in 2009. I then go off and lead a church, and really, if you had come to my church, you wouldn't have known I'd written a book. I didn't really talk about it. Then in 2020, when George Floyd is murdered, I feel God speak to me, and I feel like, okay, I've got to do something here. And the main reason I felt that was this. George Floyd gets murdered. Lots of black people, I suppose including me, are struggling a bit. We don't know what to say. Lots of people who had maybe buried all their issues, it all just began to come out. And many of us were in churches that were very diverse. And people didn't know what to do, and churches didn't know what to do. And the majority of churches initially didn't know what to say. And in fact, what they did say was this: of course we should be anti-racist. So the response of the church, I found initially, was no different to my empathetic neighbour who wasn't a Christian. Yeah? He was saying, of course we need to be anti-racist. The church was saying, of course we need to be anti-racist. And I'm thinking, I would have thought the church might have had more to say, because we're not a group of people that are just sitting around. We've got the Bible, the Holy Spirit, we've got God on our side. Surely there's more to say than we ought to be anti-racist. Anyway, I really felt God speak to me, and he spoke to me about the Reconciled Church in Ephesians chapter 2, where it talks about he reconciled them both and brought peace. And I remember saying to some friends, the church isn't as reconciled as it thinks it is. We're not as together on these things as we think we are. And I remember in that meeting feeling a couple of things. First of all, we need to do something around having a theology of reconciliation, because one of the reasons I think the church didn't have anything to say was it didn't have a theology in which it could contain the issue of race. So we were more influenced by what was going on outside the church. And some people were leaving the church because people on YouTube seemed to be saying things that made more sense to them than what was going on in the church. And I found that difficult. Anyway, I felt God say to me, talk about a theology of reconciliation. The church needs a way of handling this issue. Secondly, I felt we have to do something about history. We have to, I don't know how, but there is a history that has to be faced. There is a history that has to be understood. We can't just ignore it. When I went through all of those dates from the 50s and 60s to the 70s and 80s to the 90s and the 2000s and all of that, the truth is the church, at every kind of different stage, the church didn't necessarily respond any different to the way the culture responded. So back in the 50s and 60s when people came over, I remember many of them were Christians, they come over from Christian nations that we had gone and we had brought the gospel to them. Many of them, and they still remember it, were asked not to come back to church. They weren't welcome in churches. Yeah? The reason there are so many black Pentecostal churches, particularly in places like Brixton, is not because people came to plant churches. Simply, it's because they weren't welcome in other churches. That was one of the things that happened. And then, in those early years, in the 70s and 80s, when I was in church, and I'm hop-skipping around trying to avoid getting beaten up or whatever it was, church had no idea what was going on. Yeah? There was no understanding of the world that I was living in. And I've only never grown up in this. I was in a Baptist church, and then I was in a different kind of church. I'm the only black pastor I've ever had. So I've grown up in the church in the UK. But they didn't really know what was going on. And so then, so 2020 comes, and I realise we've got to do something about reconciliation. We've got to find a way to be able to speak about history. And we've also got to find a way to help people who are in the church from different places to feel like they can thrive in those spaces and not just assimilate and survive, but how do they thrive? How do they make it work? And those are the things that kind of came out for me. And so that book was written, as I said, during that time. This book I'm talking about 2020 was when we started a group called the Reconciled Church group at the beginning of 2021. And this book is really the culmination of the last 5 years. And what it essentially is this. There's a bit of a diagnostic about reconciliation, but really the majority of the chapters in here is trying to form a systematic theology of reconciliation into which we can look at issues such as race. So it's not really primarily a book about race. It's really a book about God is a reconciling God. And there are things that we need to put right and make right. And we've looked at how we do that in this book. So most of the chapters are really about that. Chapters 3 to 10 are really around that. And what I'm doing is I'm walking through the scripture. I'm walking through from Genesis through to Revelation. I'm walking and looking at where does the Bible talk about reconciliation and how can we do that better. So then just thinking about the last couple of years, because obviously we've had what became clear to us, and I don't know whether this has happened, but you remember the tragic situation that happened in Southport a couple of years ago when those 3 young girls were killed. And we had lots of protests around the country. Our group, the Reconciled Church group, began to run it was a daily prayer meeting, wasn't it? It was a daily Zoom prayer meeting for a week or so, whilst, every day you were getting up and there was incidents in different parts of the country. So we began to pray every single day. Every morning we were meeting to pray. People from all over the country were just joining us on Zoom, meeting to pray. One of the things that became clear to us then was there were Bible-believing, God-honouring, God-fearing Christians who I suppose they were beginning to interact a little bit more and listen a little bit more to some of the kind of, I suppose, nationalistic thoughts that were coming out, some of the, I suppose, quite anti-immigration thoughts, which I could kind of understand, but I hadn't seen that until 2024. I hadn't seen that among Christians who went to really evangelical churches. But from 2024, that became quite a big thing. And even in churches that I know, there were people who were leaving church because they wanted to go to a church that was going to be a bit more radical on those kinds of issues. And for me, part of the issue was, wow, the church doesn't have a way of understanding this. That means we can handle what's going on out there. And let me give you an example. If you think about marriage, and the world has all sorts of ideas about marriage. Yeah, and people, in fact, so many people would argue, don't get married, live together, and that's fine. And some people even here might think that, but Christians fundamentally, we don't think that. We kind of think, no, marriage is still a good thing. Even though we think that, even though marriages fail and all of that, we still think that. And you don't need to be a theologian to be able to say that. Do you know what I mean? If you're in a church with teenagers, probably some of them could say, oh yeah, this is what Christian marriage is. We understand it. And because of that, we've not necessarily got caught up with thinking that marriage is anything other than what the Bible says, but still what we think. Now, I'm sure there are different thoughts around it, but fundamentally that's still what we think. And that's because our understanding of marriage biblically is very clear. It's very clear. Our understanding of reconciliation and race is not clear. And therefore, we can hear all sorts of things, and we can think all sorts of ideas, and we can realize that sometimes our connection to our own race and background is deeper than our connection to the faith that we profess. Yeah? Sometimes that's what happens. So you can have people, and maybe I imagine that they are here. The Reconciled Church group, we have literally been up and down the country. We've been in Teesside, Plymouth, Exeter, Newcastle, Manchester, and you would be surprised how diverse places are. The one for me was we were in Exeter a few weeks ago in a little Baptist church in Exeter. When I asked the question, how many of you come from a land that's 1,000 or more miles away? A third of the church stand up. In Exeter. A third of the church stand up. And yet, you might have come from 1,000 more miles away, and you're now in a church where there was probably another third of the church were born within 10 miles of the building. And yet, in theory at least, you have more in common with a believing brother or sister who's come from a very different background to you. In theory, you have more in common with them than your neighbour who doesn't know Jesus. That's the theory. The reality is, culture can get in there. But in reality, you know, when we as Christians, we read John 21, and Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter's let him down, and Peter says, "Of course you know I love you." Yeah. If you're a Christian here, that's you. Jesus says, "Do you love me?" He says, "Of course I love you. Of course I love you." Well, you can have that love for Jesus, whether you were born 5 miles from here or 5,000 miles from here. You can have that same love for Jesus. Yeah? It's the same thing. And yet, so much of the culture gets in. So, I'm going to stop there, Richard. And I'm happy to obviously take questions. Yeah, I mean, there's more I could say, but I think I'm quite happy to.
Indeed. What I suggest is that you just turn to your neighbour, 2s and 3s, see if there are any other questions you'd like to ask, put them into Slido, and then after about 5 minutes or so, we'll field some of those questions.
Oh, have you had questions?
We're going to start with a couple of questions about what the Bible says about this topic. So one question, can you share some Bible verses that point towards being a reconciled church and its importance? And another one, how would you summarize what the Bible says about reconciliation to a non-Christian?
Okay, so just looking at what does the Bible say about the Reconciled Church, there are kind of two places that I probably go now in the Bible. First of all, I would go to the book of Acts, because in the book of Acts you've got the first church, Jerusalem, but then you have the first, what I would call, if I can use that term, Reconciled Church in Antioch. It's the first time that you see it. And why do I call it a Reconciled Church? Because in the church in Antioch, for the first time, you have Jews and Gentiles that have come to faith together. Yeah? In the Jewish church in Jerusalem, that wasn't the case. In Antioch, that's what happens. And that's massive, because if you think about the way Jews functioned, where they had certain things that kept them separate from Gentiles, food laws, circumcision and all the ceremonial days, all of those things. When you became a Christian from a Jewish background, it was massively costly. Yeah? You're now sitting, you're eating, you're being friends with Gentiles. So we see that for the first time in Acts. And what it says, you've got Jews, Gentiles, who initially would be distinctive, but what it says is they're first called Christians at Antioch. And that's important because when they're called Christians, you couldn't distinguish between the Jew and the Gentile. Yeah, they had become one kind of people. They were being seen as one people. What then happens in that church is a couple of things very quickly. First of all, it's the church where we first see diverse leadership. Acts chapter 13 describes a leadership team of an African, of someone who was born in or brought up in the royal household, of I suppose a radical Pharisee, of a wealthy man in Barnabas, a radical Pharisee in Paul. You've got diverse leadership in that church. So the first church that's reconciled has this diverse leadership. And it's from that church in Antioch that the message of the gospel goes to the world. But probably a bigger thing that I love about that story is this. In Galatians chapter 2, it talks about Peter and Barnabas withdrawing from relationship, from table fellowship with the Gentiles. So they had been friendly with the Gentiles, eating with them, friends with them. People came from Jerusalem that put them under pressure, and they began to pull back from that relationship. They began to pull back. When Paul confronts Peter, he says to him, "You're pulling back. It's not just that was unkind. What you're doing is not acting in accordance with the gospel. The gospel has allowed you now. It's broken down the barriers that you can now be in relationship with these people, and you are pulling back from that." And there is something that happens, I suppose, in a lot of people, which was happening to Peter at that moment. We can have a gravitational pull towards people like ourselves, even though the gospel breaks down the barriers that allow us to go into relationship with others. That's what Peter was doing. The second place I would go is to Ephesians, in Ephesians chapter 2 particularly, because in Ephesians chapter 2, it's where Paul's unpacking the reconciliation, and he's saying to many of the Gentile Christians there, once you were foreigners, you were on the outside, but now, because of the blood of Christ, you have been brought near, and you have been reconciled with the Jews. And that has happened through the cross. It's the blood of Jesus that has broken down the wall that now makes you reconciled with the Jews. So, and then you can unpack that, because when you go through to the rest of Ephesians, it talks about the practical outworking of that reconciliation. Yeah? That you no longer live as the Gentiles do. That you live a life worthy of the calling that you've received. And so there is something in the scripture which talks about being reconciled, being in relationship, and that happening because of the cross. And then even in Ephesians chapter 3, where it talks about, the manifold wisdom of God being made known to principalities and powers, it's almost as though, if in Ephesians, Paul is saying, look, God is displaying to principalities and powers this church that is genuinely diverse and reconciled. That's how important it is to him. He's displaying it to everyone. And so there is something about about those. Now, there are many, many other passages I could go to, but Acts and Ephesians would be two of the main ones. And what was the second half?
And that's really, really helpful. So now some questions of application. How do we counter the rise of Christian nationalism in UK churches that promote a far-right ideology as if it's based on Christianity?
Yeah. So for me, this is a genuine answer. So this isn't like I'm trying to avoid an answer. Obviously, these things are on the rise. The main thing the church can do is to build itself as a reconciled people, that it becomes a witness to the world. Yeah? That we become something that they are not. That we understand something that they don't understand. One of the reasons Christian nationalism, I think, is infiltrating or getting involved in churches is we don't have that theology. We don't have that understanding. And when the pressure has come, people are just going, oh, where am I going to go? Where am I going to go? And so there is something about what we build as the church. The other thing is, you need two things. You need conviction that churches should look like this. That the fact that people come over here, whatever the politics of it, somehow in the sovereignty of God, people have come to this place. And that's a sovereign God thing. Yeah? And you go back as far as Deuteronomy, it says, when God says to the Israelites after they've come out of Egypt, and he tells them very clearly, I love the foreigner among you. Giving him food and clothing, you too should love the foreigner. Yeah? Because you were once foreigners and slaves in Egypt. So God makes it really clear what he thinks about it. Yeah? And are we able to build the kind of church that we know we want to build, even though there is a pressure to do something else? Now, I actually think, bizarrely, that some of the help for the churches to counteract nationalism, to build those kinds of churches, are some of the migrants that are in your church. Because do you know what? You're going to have potentially Nigerians in this church who have lived with Muslim extremism. They've lived with stuff. They've lived around stuff. And they know how to pray. They know how to stand. And some of our help, we should be looking at other people who love Jesus, not just at people who look and sound like us. So that would be some of my kind of responses to it.
And I mean, this is from the other side of the divide. I don't know if you'd say the same thing. In my experience, some of the white working class living in Cheltenham are racist. They have very stereotypical views. How would you begin to challenge and educate? I mean, would you say the same thing, that the best way is for the church to be a different sort of community, or is there something we can do more to challenge those views within our culture and society?
Yeah, so I suppose what I really feel and what I really felt when I started the Reconciled Church group those years ago was my focus was the church, because I think if we can win the church, we can change the world. Yeah, but we need to win the church. Personally, I think you can challenge views, but sometimes I think it's a cultural moment we're in. Do you know what I mean? So there will be a different cultural moment. I think I almost think it's more important that the church knows how to stand its ground and hold its place than necessarily challenging. Because I find if I were to challenge everyone who made comments to me, I'd be challenging all the time. So I've come to that place where I go, do you know what? My way is not to go around challenging. My way is to try and build something that's different. And so I would do that. I do that prayerfully. I do that through really holding the ground. It's the Ephesians 6. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's against principalities and powers in the heavenly realms. And what does the armour of God do? It enables me to stand. So that's kind of the approach I take, probably. So
here's another question. And how do you respond to... Oh, it keeps on flicking up. How do you respond to the modern cultural narrative that it's now the white British man that's persecuted and hard done by?
Again, I think if I'm honest with that one, I would say before you hook onto that, you do need to do some work around history. You do need to understand how we got here and what the differences are. You know, we do need to understand that. If you even think about, again, I don't mean to be controversial, but last year, or was it last year? When was it? Trump said the other day, didn't he, that no one else fought in Iraq but the Americans. Yeah? And we were like, how dare you? We were there. Yeah? That's why Prince Harry, I was there. Don't tell me no one did it. Yeah? So we responded like that to Trump, and then you saw in the news, you know, there were 457 soldiers or whatever it was. It was only about 2017, 2018, when on the Remembrance Day parade, we acknowledged that some of the Caribbean islands fought alongside the British. Yeah, we need to remember our own history. 2017, I was listening to the commentator, and he said, here's some people from Trinidad and Tobago, here are some people from this place and that place. They were only invited in like 10 years ago. If you were to add up the number of people that fought alongside the British in the Second World War, aside from the Americans, there were more people from the Commonwealth than there were actual British soldiers. Now, the main reason for that was India. Yeah? And in the First World War, India provided nearly 1 million people. Yeah? We can forget our history, and therefore we can operate as though, you know, all these things that are going on, they're going on to us. My great uncle fought in the war. Yeah? Came over from Jamaica to here in 1944. Was here for 3 years as part of the RAF. Yeah? But I don't see him walking up. So some of these things, we need to understand our history.
Great. Related to this, how do you love the church in the United States, which is becoming increasingly white nationalist, particularly in the seats of power? Does it still reflect Christ?
I mean, I think, so my view, when Trump won his second thing, I said to the church, okay, I might not have voted for Trump, yeah, but he won, and I go, God, you're sovereign. No one comes to power except that you have allowed them, yeah? Now that might be hard for us because we might have a politics that goes, that's ridiculous, how can that be? No one comes to power, yeah? Don't think that he got through somehow and God was sleeping and go, oh my goodness, where is he? He's there, I didn't want, no. God has purpose and plans that we don't know about, yeah? And so you pray, yeah? I don't pray against people in that sense. I did say, I admitted that in Brexit I prayed, but then I've shifted because I've realised, okay, God, you are teaching us something through what we're going through now. Yeah? I pray we learn the lesson. And I pray that the church becomes what it needs to be, courageous, have conviction and courage, because that's what we need in this place. So I'm not trying to, what's helpful about America is it tells us how influential America has become across the world. Yeah, we are not dissimilar. We're not quite there, but it's not dissimilar. And you see the way that even someone like Elon Musk is supporting some of the stuff that's going on over here. But we can still pray, and we want to pray that God's ways have come through. And really, it's praying for the church. Don't think to yourself, church has got nothing to do with it. Nothing. Church is God's response. It's God's answer. And so we pray for that.
Great. Now, these are two related questions. Can you give an example of a church whose leadership has been transformed by reconciliation, and how did it affect the growth of that church? And then, why do many non-white Christians come for a while and then leave and go elsewhere? How can we break down those barriers so that they stay and get involved?
You might in a local church.
Exactly.
Why do they come?
Yeah. So one is related to
leadership,
the leadership and the growth of the church.
Yeah.
The other is, why do some non-white people turn up and then leave?
Yeah. Okay. So the leadership one is interesting. What I have seen, and I have seen some churches where they have become, the leadership is genuinely diverse. Yeah, and what I've noticed with those churches where that's happened is there is relationships that is long-standing. Yeah, so if I take my own example, in my church, it's a small church in Brixton, but it is diverse. One of my fellow elders, Phil, who's white, I've known him since I was 11. Yeah, he was the best man at my wedding. He spoke at my daughter's wedding. Yeah, I didn't mind that. I was quite happy for that. I was crying and blubbering. And I think he also did the dedication for my granddaughter. I didn't mind that either. So in our church, there has been this long-standing relationship. And I know other churches where it's not gimmicky, there is just long-standing relationship. That's the way you do it. Yeah? That's the way you do it. You have to build a relationship. Because what needs to happen is the persons who are coming in, particularly if they're coming from a different background, need to come to the point where they are influencing how it works. And you don't influence how it works from the outside. Yeah? You have to be in relationship. Yeah? So you need somebody around you. And if you don't have that, I would be praying, God, give us leaders who can really help us. But then there's a willingness to open up. Why do people come and go? Yeah, so what you'll find is that people will come and there'll be barriers that they observe that are invisible to you. That might make them go, can I stay here? You know, is there room for me? Now, our answer to that is often representation. Can we get someone up front? You know, is there anyone who can lead worship? Is there anyone who can, you know, do something to help us? That kind of works for a little bit, but really it's a much slower job of building relationships. Building relationships, and over time people beginning to see a difference. It's not how friendly you are. Yeah, that's not what's keeping them, or that's not what's sending them. It's, do I think there's a place for me here? Yeah, and that takes time. And you know, sometimes we dive on people and we think, oh man, this family, this is great, we'd love them to stay. And they're not used to that. And actually, even in my book, I talk about it. Sometimes they see that as a bit transactional. You know, oh, they're after me for this. There's one guy who I spoke to when we were in Newcastle. It was this really nice Zimbabwean family. This guy, he could have been in leadership in the church. They were almost begging him, please, please, please. And he said to me, one of the reasons I've stayed out is they don't know me well enough to know when I'm struggling. There's not enough of a relationship here that I would feel safe. Because if I was struggling, nobody would know. So I think there are all sorts of reasons, but the long-term relationship thing is what really helps.
And this is a question particularly about Islam. Muslims have said on TV that Islam failed to conquer Europe from west or east, but they will now conquer it by immigration and procreation. How should we respond?
So do you want my honest response to that? We're Christians, you don't fear that. You don't fear what people are saying on TV. Yeah? You have the living God. Yeah? And we've got to trust him. Yeah? We have to build, we're not trying to fight this thing coming here and that thing coming there. In a way, Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech was the 60s version of that. They're coming and they're what they're going to do. And that was really about me and my generation. I don't fear those things. Yeah? Not because I'm a big brave person, but because I'm like, he that is in me is greater than he that is in the world. Yeah? If we take it seriously, taking it seriously doesn't mean we're protesting. Taking it seriously means we're praying and we're building the local church. And we're not sitting at home thinking, oh, I'm not going to church, I'm going to do. No, we're going, my goodness, I need to get in. I need to build the church that Jesus would have us build. I don't fear that. I'll be honest, I don't.
Yeah, so these two questions are related. Do you think it's possible to be skeptical about mass immigration and still be genuinely loving of the diversity of the church and the nation? And how do we balance national borders and national security with global Christian fellowship?
Okay, what's the first question?
So the first was...
No, the first one of those two that you've just read.
Yeah.
Skeptical.
Yeah, skeptical about mass immigration and still genuinely loving of diversity in the church.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's true. Yeah, it's possible to go, what are we doing? Yeah, what are we doing as a nation? How are we working it? But then when people come, welcome. Yeah, welcome. Yeah, so you're welcome. I've got no idea what we're doing out there, but you're welcome. And that is how I think the church should respond. I'm not saying that we don't want Christians to get involved in politics. Of course we want, Christians to get involved in politics and all that kind of stuff. But we're not driven by politics. Yeah, we're driven by faith. Yeah, we welcome people because of who Jesus is. We don't welcome them because it's all gone wrong out there. We welcome them because we know that welcome the stranger. Yeah, we have too many stories in the Bible that push us that way. So I think it's very possible to be skeptical.
It's a difficult balance, though, isn't it? Because if you are a Christian involved in politics, and you are really concerned about mass immigration.
I think that if you're a Christian involved in politics, do you know what? And I know, again, I might sound really kind of simplistic about it. I'm spending more time on my knees than I've ever done. Because I'm saying, God, I need wisdom here. Yeah? I think this is a nonsense, but at the same time, we welcome the stranger. So I think we have to be able to, the Christian has to be able to find that kind of balance.
Yeah. I have just one more question. Was there a reason why your parents went to the church you grew up in rather than one of the planted ones? Does that mean one of the existing ones?
You mean like why they didn't go to a black church?
Exactly,
yeah. Okay, yeah, good question. So, my mum was really the Christian, yeah? My dad did come from a Christian background in Jamaica, but my mum was really the Christian. And she was, I would call my mum a pragmatist. She went to the church that was closest, yeah? And it was a Baptist church around the corner. And so she would drag the 4 kids to the Baptist church. My dad said, you lot can go, but they're racist, so I'm not going, yeah? So I understood when I began to look into the law and all of that about, when certain laws came in, I could understand why my dad was so angry, yeah? That he was quite bitter about stuff. My mum wasn't like that at all. My mum went, and I remember my mum, she went to this church, and then a family came to the church. It was an Ethiopian woman who came to the church. And I remember this woman telling me many years ago, she said, your mum's advice to me was stick to the ladies in the church. Yeah, she didn't care who they were, just stick to the ladies in the church. So my mum was like that. She was a pragmatist. We went to the local Baptist church. The local Baptist church then joined another church, and then blah, 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 blah.
Owen's mentioned his books, but I think there's a QR code, we'll put it up there. If you'd like to, not the Slido one, but if you'd like to buy a book, you can scan the QR code, and then I think Luke and Halwyn and Naomi will be at the back, and you can get your book. I know that there's so much more that Owen could have said, and so Owen, thank you so much for sharing so much of yourself. And Richard, I think you are an amazing chair. You do chair questions so well. So why don't you finish us off?
So thanks so much for coming tonight. We're hoping in the autumn to do something on AI. I mean, this is a massive issue which is increasingly concerning us. You probably know that the Pope's recent encyclical, Magnificat Humanitas, I think it's called, came out just a couple of weeks ago. For those of you in this church, I've written about it in our Wednesday Word this week, so if you haven't looked at the Wednesday Word, do have a look at that, my initial thoughts on it. And we're thinking as a church of producing an AI policy of some sort. Anyway, we're hoping to get someone to come and talk about that in the autumn, so do look out for that, do come along, do bring friends who are not Christians, who should be concerned about that as well. But again, Owen, thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank you all you guys for coming as well. Good night.